Hey, everybody, welcome back. I'm Emily Moyer. This is Strange Mosaic. I have been away for a couple of weeks. I still have a few shows coming that I recorded before I left, but I have not done a show in like 2 weeks. So I'm getting my show pants back on. And I'm doing it blindly today because our guest today is a friend of Nish's, which means she exists only in the audio realm. And I'm also doing something I've never done before, that I'm having a guest on who I'm not familiar with at all, other than Nish and Jeff have both said, you should talk to her. You'd really like her. So consider this the platonic podcast version of a blind date. JJ, welcome to Strange Mosaic.
Well, thank you, Emily. It's nice to be here.
Awesome. So really, like I know of you because of Nish has mentioned you. And I think a couple of times when I've been just scrolling through and popping in here and there for a few minutes, like when there's been like a panel chat on Obelisk or something like that, I may have heard you a little bit, but I'm not super familiar. And I've been playing with doing more of these shows where I just kind of get to know someone. But basically, like Nish and Jeff just told me, she lives in New York. She thinks it's kind of weird. You guys could have a good chat. You should have her on. So are you from New York or did you move there as an adult?
No, I'm from Northwest New Jersey originally, and I've been in and out of this area my whole life. And I'm actually not living in New York anymore. I'm kind of in limbo. I'm moving to Chicago shortly, but I
Oh,
have spent a good portion of my adult life here. I've been in and out and working and living in the city for about 30 years.
yeah, well, that's interesting. The jump from New York to Chicago doesn't do anything to assist with the weather or the corruption, uh, but it's definitely a change for sure. I lived in New York for a year, almost a year. It was probably a little less than a year, but I had been a big fan of New York my entire life. Like, even before I ever visited there, when I was young, I wanted to live there. And then after the first trip there, it was like, oh my God, I definitely want to live there. Like, most little girls dream about growing up and getting married and having children. All I cared about was moving to New York. Um, and then I did, and I found it to be a very different experience to live there than to visit there. And I didn't like it at all. And I left after probably 10 months or something like that. But it was definitely one of the most meaningful experiences in my life, even though it wasn't what I would classify as a good one, right? And it is definitely different than any other place that I've ever been. So have you been there mostly just because it's sort of around where you grew up? Like people who, grew up, somewhere in Southern California, moved to Los Angeles when they're older, or were you attracted there because of work, arts, culture, people, what kind of thing?
Well, I'm an artist, so I have been attracted to the area just for all the different creative aspects and the availability of supplies and all sorts of things. I've actually lived around quite a bit. I went to art school in Savannah, Georgia,
Ah,
and then I came back up to New Jersey and went to university, and then I moved to Naples, Florida for a year, and then I went out to Seattle for 5 years, and then I came back to the East Coast, and I've been kind of popping around. I actually was recently living in Cape Cod for the last little over 2.5 years. I moved up there right before COVID started. And
okay.
I knew I was having strange experiences in New York and knew that something huge was coming and I had to get out of there. And my deadline to leave was November 2019. So I had an opportunity to live in Cape Cod and I took it. And then sure enough, everything happened. But as far as New York, yeah, I mean, I've been coming to the city since I was a little girl. So it was kind of the beacon of everything since childhood. And
Mm.
as far as making a living, it can make and break you, but it's where you can make a good chunk of money.
Yep.
But it's always good to make some money and get the hell out of there. So
Yeah, I moved to New York in 2004. right? And I think one of the things that I didn't count on, like I had visited New York many times prior to 9/11, right? And then I did visit very briefly, like just overnight, one time after 9/11, right? But I didn't, it was literally just like pop in, go for a fancy dinner, go to the club, leave, right? I think I didn't consider that when I decided to move there, right? Like, because I do think that something significant had changed, you know, and I hadn't factored that in. I wasn't what we would call awake yet, per se. I mean, I've always been sort of a suspicious person who felt that like there's what you think is going on and there's what's really going on, and they're not usually the same. But I hadn't started questioning 9/11 as anything other than something that, like, you know, I was mad about because it shut down the party scene that I was involved in with dance music after that, like, which seemed weird to me. Like, what does that have to do? But it, you know, it was really about larger stuff. And so, so I think I didn't take into consideration some things that, as my awareness and my esoteric knowledge grew later, I would have otherwise taken into consideration. But I agree with you. One of the things people think about New York, like, oh my God, New York is so expensive. How do you ever afford it? I actually, that was one problem I did not have in New York. Like, it wasn't like rolling in dough, right? But I definitely made more money than I made in Los Angeles. And I actually found the cost of living to be less in New York because you don't have all the expenses related with a car right there. And so it's a good place to make a chunk of money, to get, like, especially if you can get a little bit of head, because if you can put away money there, then you can go somewhere else and do something with that money. So that wasn't anything I struggled with. I struggled with finding jobs I liked and people I liked, and the energy of the city and the weather, and not having, like, be able to buy more than one bag of groceries at a time or anything like you know. But I didn't struggle to make money. Like, even on like the slowest day at a restaurant in New York, you still made way more tips than often a busy day in other cities.
Exactly.
You know, and so that is, I think for people out there who need to have that New York experience, if you're concerned about the financial aspect of it, I would put that to the bottom of your list of concerns. and
Yes,
forward if you say
especially
that.
now.
Yeah.
Especially now, there's an unusual amount of jobs available that they're having trouble filling.
So tell me, do you agree with my assessment that New York was a far different place post 9/11 than prior?
Yeah, absolutely. It really was. And I was working, oh God, I'm trying to think now. I worked for IKEA for a while as a kitchen planner in the
Mm-hmm.
early 2000s. And I was in this area when 9/11 happened, and I saw the towers from my apartment window in Elizabeth, New Jersey,
Mm-hmm.
and dealt with a bunch of the frenzy surrounding that whole, well, the day and the aftermath. And then I ended up working in the city, uh, well, for several years after that, and just all kinds of financial decline and we had eventually had the recession, and um, people, the energy was different, the people were different, everything had changed significantly from what I recall. It
Mm-hmm.
was a very unusual, tense, messed up time, basically, for several years afterwards. And I don't think it's ever really been the same since then.
And would you, let me see how I want to ask this so that it comes out as I mean it. Would you say that's because the majority of people in the city, like, believe the nonsense story, or would you say it was because it was such a powerful, energetic event in terms of what actually disappeared, the buildings, that it's kind of like when a person has electroshock therapy or a stroke or a seizure or something like that, that it sort of rearranges everything and it's never quite the same?
Well, I don't know. I don't know what it seems like. There's a bunch of people that now have changed their thoughts on what really happened that day. But I think because so many people were right in the heart of things,
Mm-hmm.
it was so traumatic, and it did change their brain pattern and
Mm-hmm.
their psychology. Absolutely.
Yeah. That area where it occurred was not, we may have gone down to the World Trade Center. I don't even know if we did. Like when I went there the first time when I was like 12 or 13 with my family, like I remember going to the Empire State Building, and I don't remember if we went to the World Trade Center or not. If we did go, it didn't make a large impression on me, and we didn't stay in that area for a long time. It was made, if we did go, I didn't even understand that that was the area of New York we were in. Most of my experience in New York was like from as a kid, younger, right before I ever moved there, was sort of from the village higher, right, not lower.
Same here.
Yeah, and so that like, and then I'd say like I probably only even went into that area once or twice when I was living in New York after, right? And so it wasn't even something that I thought about or really considered, right? Like it just seemed like an appendage that wasn't attached to the body to me, right? And always. And so I think that was part of why I didn't consider that when I was making the choice to move there. Like to me, I always loved New York because let's just be honest, like, the restaurants and the shopping and the nightlife, and there was just sort of everything everywhere all at once energy to it that has always appealed to me. Like I like action. I guess maybe I like chaos, right? And New York is sort of like a controlled chaos, like on the edge of being uncontrolled, or at least it was, at that time, right? And I just kind of liked that, right? There was like a million things happening at once. And also at the time that I moved there, like it seemed to me from afar, and then I got there and found that it wasn't really true in the way I had thought. There seemed to be the kind of dance music scene that I really liked, that I was going to like there. And so those were the things that appealed to me about it. I didn't ever really think about like, will I actually like the people there? Will I like having to walk everywhere and go like days at a time without seeing green grass? I never considered that stuff, right?
Yeah.
I was lured in by the amount of good stuff in a small space, right?
Yeah, well, it's very seductive that way. It definitely is.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
like it's a love-hate relationship, that is for sure.
Yeah. What I experienced with people when I lived there, so I had basically like three sets of experiences. I was working in restaurants. I was going to bars and nightclubs, and parties. And then I was like walking around the town and riding subways and things like that. Those were the things I did on a regular basis. Right. On a day off, I might go to a museum or an art gallery. When I first moved there, I took the, bus and the train out to Elizabeth to get some furniture at IKEA. You know what I mean? But mostly it was like,
you know where that is, because
I know exactly where it is. I've been there a couple of times. And I had some roommates that I had known from living here in Austin prior that made the transition a little easier in terms of like not having to live by myself or with someone I didn't know. But it also, I was living with two sweaty, stinky guys, and they, were living in an area that I might not have chosen myself because they were more concerned with like, a cheap apartment than being in a good area or whatever. But so for me, the days mostly consisted of like commuting to and from wherever I was working, and maybe like doing some social activity after work or on a day off or whatever. But working in restaurants, I found that that the people I was working with were mostly really not nice because they were actors, and they were a little different. I was very familiar with working with actors from having lived in Los Angeles, but there is an awareness amongst actors in Los Angeles that they're not really actors. The actors in New York think they're real actors, and so when they can't find work, they're really pissed off.
Yeah.
Right? They take it a lot more seriously. They're just more serious people in general. And so I found it very unpleasant to work around them. And I even, I had this one restaurant that I worked at down on 14th and like, I don't know, like 7th or 8th or something like that. And I didn't really get fired from there, but they found a job for me at a different restaurant because while I was good at my job, they just didn't really like me. And everyone, all the people who worked there, you know, were actors, right? And I guess I was having a really hard time when I lived there. I wasn't like my normal chipper self, but I wasn't an actor. And so like my sort of purpose for being there and how I just did stuff was different. And like I remember being called and they're like, we don't really know what to say because we can't point to anything we've done wrong. We just really don't like you. So here, we found you a job at this actually restaurant where you'll make more money. So, you know, good riddance, right? It was like one of the weirdest.
Involuntarily relocated. Yeah, that's great.
It was really weird, right? So I didn't have that observation. So there was the actors, and then the managers were these people who like, and I've noticed this with managers in restaurants, other places, but it was heightened in New York. Like they somehow thought they were like gods or very important people.
Yeah.
And my assessment of most restaurant managers, not all, I've had a few excellent restaurant managers, but my assessment of most, especially lower level managers, is that they're just like, their life has just been not working out longer than mine has been not working out.
Well, I can attest to all this. My ex-husband was in acting and also ran the circuit with the restaurants and various positions. And I heard all of the horror stories, especially he started working at really high-end places. So
Me too. Yeah.
he was working with, you know, the real actors and the real fashion people and all of that. And Harvey Weinstein was showing up for dinner and things like that. So, and I worked in high-end retail and I dealt with celebrities on a regular basis. So we both were getting a taste of that and the various people, even in retail, the same thing with the managers thinking they're gods and the salespeople thinking they're gods. And some of those were, you know, actors and actresses, wannabes.
Yep.
It's very cutthroat and very competitive.
Yeah. When I first got to New York, well, like I worked at this one restaurant for like 2 or 3 days. Because I just hadn't figured out the lay of the land yet. So I worked at this one restaurant for like 2 or 3 days and decided I didn't want to work there. But then the very next restaurant I worked at was Spice Market, right? In the meat packing district, which is celebrities, fashion design, all those kind of people are there, right? And like, in fact, the Clintons dined there while I was working there. And this was in 2004. And after their meal, when they were getting up to leave, the entire restaurant started chanting 4 more years, right? So like, you know, but it was, I mean, every night before service started, they would give us a list of which celebrities were going to be dining there. And like, I had never seen that in Los Angeles. I did see that after, because years after I lived in New York, Tom Colicchio of Kraft opened a restaurant in Los Angeles and I worked there and they did that too. Right. And but the New York was the first time I'd experienced this, where it's like, okay, these are the people that are going to be dining here tonight. And like basically, you know, creating the apartheid of famous people and non-famous people as to who's going to serve who and who's going to get the most attention and blah, blah, how you need to behave around these people. And it was very weird for me, right? I grew up in Los Angeles, so I've been around celebrities my whole life, and I never thought I needed instructions on how to act, right? It was bizarre, but New York takes all that shit very seriously. It's much more formal in New York than it is in Los Angeles. So that was the work experience, right? With actors. And people, when I said that like their lives just hadn't been working out longer if they were managers, right? When you get to the point where like you've been a server so long and you haven't made it in acting yet or whatever, that you just cave and decide to take the position with benefits because you're also starting to have the psychological breakdown and the health problems from like all the years of like drinking after the shifts and all that kind of stuff, right? So you're like, okay, it's probably less money, but I'm going to take this position just to cover some of my other costs, right? Kind of thing. Yeah. So then there was the people on the subway, right? Because I lived up in Washington Heights and I was working down in the Village. So every day I had the long subway ride, right? And it was interesting. Like I saw some of the weirdest things I've ever seen in my entire life. So it was great people watching. I appreciate that. But I also noticed that like a lot of people, something had changed from when I had been there before. I always appreciated the way people in New York would look you in the eye, right? As opposed to Los Angeles, where it was a little bit more like evasive. But when I was living there, and this was post 9/11, I felt rather than like looking me in the eye, the people were actually looking through me or past me, right? Like there was like a blank stare that seemed to like be gazing far off into like a black hole. Right. And it was noticeable. It wasn't just like, you know, we all have come across someone like that once in a while and it kind of gives you the chills or it's just very noticeable. But it was like a regular occurrence during those, you know, and you can sometimes get into these weird scenarios with people while you're on the subway, like you're standing and they're sitting, but you like are kind of eyeing each other or looking at each other the whole time or something like that. Right. Yes. And there's a lot of information exchanged, even if no words.
Very much so.
Yeah. And so I noticed that sort of vacancy, and it was the same vacancy in the people's eyes that I noticed about like the energy of the city. There was still like motion, right? Like it looked like there was energy, but it was coming from a different place, or it was sort of initiated by something different than it used to be.
Yeah, I noticed that too. And it seemed to escalate as the years went on. And I mean, specifically now in the last, 3-4 years, I see it all the time when I'm back in this area. I am down here. I'm across the river. I'm staying in Hoboken, New Jersey, but I've been in and out of the city while I'm waiting to move into my place in Chicago. And I've been only going to the city here and there a little bit. For some reason, I just don't want to deal with it anymore. The energy is just crazier than ever. The noise it's just louder than it's ever been. And the people are frantic, and they do have that stare that you're talking about. More people than not are having it.
Yeah.
And I don't, it could be a lot of different factors, the reasons for that.
Yeah. So the other thing that I experienced was in the nightlife, right? Like I really like dance music, specifically techno. At that time, I was like really almost strictly into techno, a little bit of house back then, but I'd kind of gotten really into like a techno phase. And I would go to some club nights during the week down in the village at, what was the name of the place called? It's like in a basement. It was called Sullivan Room, the Sullivan Room.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, because Christian Smith from Tronic Records had like a weekly thing there, and you could see in this very tiny bar, like DJs that normally would be playing like large festivals or big, very big parties, because he owned a record label that many of them had put tracks out on. He could often grab them for littler. They were friends with him, so they wanted to play. So if they had played in some bigger party, either in New York or LA or Chicago or whatever, on the weekend, this was like on Tuesday night or something, they'd stop through and play there before returning to Europe or going wherever else they were going. So that part of it was really cool. But I found, I didn't find the scene to be as satisfying as like I would have thought based on like what the purported quality of the music, and whatnot was going to be. And there was also something going on there that I had seen on a small scale in Houston when I would go to parties there while I lived in Austin and in Los Angeles, but not anywhere near on the level that I noticed in New York. And that was like I don't know how to explain it, like party gangs, right? Like there was like groups of people, and they were dressed like kids who went to like raves or whatever, that were robbing and selling. Right, kind of thing. Not just, you always have your group of people that are selling drugs and whatever, right? But these were people who were like part of identifiable gangs at parties that would go around pickpocketing, pretending that they were, somebody would give them their money to go get them some pills and and they wouldn't, they'd take off with it. All kinds of crazy shit was happening, right? And it was rampant. It wasn't like things like that would generally go on at like massive parties, other places. But this shit was like happening in like 50-person clubs. Right. It was so shady. And, New York does have a lot more petty street crime in some ways than LA or certainly Austin or whatever. But I had never seen it that up close and like in your face and obvious before. And I felt like it really harmed the energy of the events, right? It just seemed to suck some of that life out of it, right?
Buzzkill.
Totally, right?
Yeah.
And it's also the only place I've ever been mugged or robbed was when I lived in New York City.
Same here.
Yeah.
Good times.
I've lived in other quote unquote dangerous cities, right? Some parts of Los Angeles are obviously considered dangerous. Right. And I've lived in Washington, D.C. And in fact, in like a pretty high crime sort of transitional neighborhood in Washington, D.C. without any problems, you know? And it was interesting, you know, like, so I got mugged like very early on. It was also while I was working at Spice Market. But I also had this really strange synchronistic, almost synchromistic and pleasant experience with the police, right? In New York, which was so weird, right? So I was walking on, I can't remember, maybe I was a little higher up than 14th, but I had walked east afterward. I was looking for something to eat. It was like late at night, right? And I was walking, I guess, to the subway. I think I'd already gotten food. I was walking to the subway. And a guy came by on his bike, and like I had my bag on my shoulder, and he like came by on his bike and slid his arm between my shoulder, my arm and my bag, and yanked the bag off, right? And but I was talking on the phone, so like it kind of got hooked. So he like fell off of his bike, and it wasn't as smooth as he sort of had probably planned, right? I struggled with him for just like a tiny second. He got off with it, but I screamed. And like all of a sudden, like he got away, but then very quickly police showed up because they said that it was funny to me because they were in a car. They're like, we heard you screaming blocks away. Like it wasn't a big scream or a loud or long scream or anything like that, right? Mm-hmm. So they came and they just took my report and they drove me all the way home, right? They drove me all the way home and they broke into my apartment for me because I lost everything. I had no money. I had no keys, right? The police officer broke into my apartment for me. And when we were signing all the stuff afterwards and whatever, the police officer had the same last name as me. The police officer, his name was Derek Moyer. Wow. Right. And I, to that point, hadn't met anybody ever with my same last name. Like there was a gentleman on the news in Los Angeles named Paul Moyer. And of course there was Bill Moyers, that was plural. But I thought that was really strange. Right? Like that, it was almost like they weren't even cops. They were just there to sort of help me get home and be safe, right? Or whatnot. And that was kind of strange, but which is not.
I had a similar experience with the cops after I got mugged in Brooklyn.
Yeah? What happened?
Well, I was minding my own business on the way. I went to the grocery store at Atlantic Center. It was kind of later at night, but it wasn't terribly late. It was like after 9 or something. Went with my granny car. I didn't take, it was November and it was kind of chilly. So I had a coat on, but I didn't take a purse. I had just my cell phone, my keys, and my bank card in my pocket. And when I was coming back from Atlantic Center, there's this long stretch. I'm trying to remember which street it's on, but it really doesn't matter. So it's this block that has a big vacant parking lot with a big high chain link fence. And on the other side of the block is the Masonic Lodge. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh my gosh, I could go on about that stuff. But so I'm coming back and all of a sudden I see these two young kids heading towards me. And I got a weird feeling. I had never felt really unsafe before, even though it was still kind of a rough neighborhood. And I just got this weird feeling like, oh man, something's going to go down. And I was basically walled in by the surrounding structures. So I had to stay. I was just like, okay, I'm going to do this. And I walked towards them and they slowed down as they got up close to me. And the kid who was shorter than me, these were young teenagers. He said, give me all your money. And I laughed at him because he his head came up to my chin and I'm 5'4". I'm like, yeah, okay. And then he showed me what looked to be a pistol. Like he opened his puffy vest and there was a gun shoved down in the front of his pants. And he said, "Give me all your money." And I'm like, "I don't have anything." And then he came and he it was the weirdest thing. It wasn't sexual or anything. He just came and rubbed up against my front.
Right. To feel if you had anything in your pockets or something.
Yeah. And he said it again. I said, "Look, I really don't have anything. I just have a bank card and some keys." And then his friend was like, "Well, you must have a cell phone." And I thought to myself, I'm like, no, I don't have a cell phone. I'm not giving that up because I wanted to use it to call when, I had the chance to get out of the situation. So the older kid goes, "Just shoot the bitch. Just shoot the fucking bitch." And I'm like, "I swear I don't have anything. I don't have anything." And I'm having this freak out because the week prior I had a dream that I was shot in the arm at night outside.
Huh.
So I'm thinking, oh my God, this is it. That's that moment. I'm going to get shot right now.
Yeah.
A strange thing happened. So they just looked at each other and they turned and started walking away in the other direction. So they didn't actually get anything off of me, but they tried to mug me.
Yeah.
So they walked down the block. I tore off around the corner with my granny cart on my cell phone, called 911. The Claston Avenue precinct got on the phone. They were there within like less than a minute. They tore around the corner, picked me up, put my granny cart in the trunk, and said, "We have them down the street. We need you to identify them." So we tore off down the block to this intersection, and sure enough, there was a cop on every corner of the intersection, and they had them cuffed already. It was crazy. It was crazy fast.
Well, it almost makes you wonder, doesn't it?
Oh yeah.
So,
it was very strange. But anyway, the cops, the fact that they took me with my granny cart of groceries, and then obviously I had to go to the station and do a report and all that stuff. But they drove me home, and I don't remember the guy's name, but he called on me to check on me later. It was interesting. I was very surprised at the response because I had been in situations before,
right.
where you're waiting or they're just assholes, all kinds of things. And this was different.
Yeah, it's so a couple of things that are interesting about what you said. It made me recall when the thing happened with me in New York, the same thing happened in terms of these guys picked me up and then someone else called, "We have him." They took me over. I'd forgotten about something. It wasn't him. They had someone else. I'm like, no, that's not him, dude. The guy was a white guy and this was like a black guy or a Puerto Rican guy or something. I was like, no, that's not him. Right. But the fact that like everybody was on it with that fast, right? It almost like, have you ever watched the show Person of Interest?
Maybe a couple of times. I'm not sure.
It's a really good show. It's really good. And it's a J.J. Abrams show.
Okay. I haven't, and I'm a big fan of his. So
watch it. It's one of his shows that went very underwatched, just like Fringe. I think his best shows don't get watched and his stupid shows get watched more. Or not stupid, but less, let's just put it this way. The stories that resonate for me more don't seem to get told as widely as the ones that do, right? But it's very, very different energy-wise than, say, Fringe, definitely than Lost or whatever, right? Yeah. But it's basically, you start to have, obviously there's like the evil aspect to tracking and surveillance and all that other stuff. But it also seems like there are people keeping an eye on certain people, and they do things to intercept or intercede, and we never know about it unless one of them comes too close. right? And that fact, just the way that how quick that response was, like I've never had any response like that in Los Angeles or Austin or anywhere else I've lived for anything, right? Like ever. So it was almost like they had a suspicion this was going to happen, or whatever. It was almost like they were in position already, right? And then just the fact that he had the same last name, the whole thing felt very personalized.
That definitely is unusual,
right? What you said about you have this weird feeling that you notice these kids. So there was one other time I had a close call, but it was so not scary that I don't even consider it that. I was by myself in San Jose del Cabo, right? And I had I was staying at a hotel that was about a mile walk from like the little town where all the good restaurants and stuff were, right? So when I had walked over, it was light, but when I was walking back, it was dark. And I think I had walked the night before, it felt fine to me. But I was walking and I just had I had this feeling come up the back of me, right? And I could sense that there was somebody behind me and that he was going to try to do something. It didn't necessarily feel scary, right? But I was well aware of it, even though I couldn't even see him or hear him yet. And then I did. And like it didn't feel like he was going to hurt me or try and steal anything. It was like weird, but I could tell he was going to do something. And then a car came, I was walking south and a car started coming north up the street. So I just jumped out in front of the car in the street so that like the car would stop its brakes and that would bring attention to the situation. Right? Yeah. And I lunged out towards the car at the same moment that the guy had lunged towards me. So the person in the car saw what happened, and pretty quickly, again, police are there. The police in Mexico are much different. Also, same thing happened. Like this time they did pick him up a little bit down, and the police said, we pick this guy up all the time. He doesn't actually ever really hurt anybody. He just tries to steal kisses from women. Like he tries to kiss them. Right. But it's there's that feeling, right? Like we walk with people, especially living in a city like New York or whatever, there's people around you all the time. You don't get your hair standing up on the back of your neck every time. Right. But it's funny how that
and I had no reason to believe. I mean, it was a 14-year-old and a 16-year-old, and I thought the 14-year-old was 10. So I'm looking like, I don't know why I feel weird about this. Don't feel like it's going to go too well, but I wasn't scared either. I was just like, this is something to pay attention to.
It almost makes me wonder if they were getting like jumped into a gang and their whole thing was like, that's one of the tasks, you have to go out and rob somebody.
Yeah, well, I found out that they had tried to rob some Russian lady just before me, somewhere down the block. And the younger kid, they were actually going to pick him up in school the next day because he had robbed another kid at school and beat him up.
Yeah.
So and then the older kid had no prior history of anything, but he was clearly getting into something.
Yeah. So. Yeah. So, okay. So there was those two things. And then there was one more thing that you said something at the end. Well, I guess I kind of covered that with the person of interest thing. I was thinking, but you should check that out, especially because it's shot in New York. And I think this is all, things have evolved for me over time in terms of how I see some of the things that are going on all around us. And in some cases happening to us. Like there was a time when I was unaware of it, and then I was aware of it and I thought all of it was bad. Right. And then I got to a place where I thought, well, some of it was bad and maybe some of it was good, but they're lying to us, and by not telling us they're doing it. So even the stuff that might be good is bad. And then now I'm at a place where I'm kind of neutral on it. Right.
Yeah.
And I think that there's like many systems and things afoot. Right. And, I am much now like when something annoying happens or something that was like a little scary, but I was okay or whatever, I'm also paying a lot more attention to like what was actually averted by that.
Right.
And I do think that we're, in the midst of a multi-layered sort of augmented reality game.
Oh yeah, me too. 100%.
Yeah. And some of the players are more real than others.
Oh yeah.
And some of the things that we have a lot of ingrained fear of are just sort of stage props of the game, even though we've been taught to very much fear them. They
Right.
don't ever really actually do anything except for stand there and scare you. And then some of the things that are more, something we would normally classify as like a threat or a danger are something coming from a different place and doing something different than how we have imagined it, right? So we're walking around confused, not clear on where we are and what, like, is everything around us real? Is part of it real? Is none of it real? Like, you know, I consider the fact that like our surrounding area, neighborhood could very likely just be like a scaffolding that has like one projection on it that is pretty constant, and then other projections over it that are sort of very variable or fluctuating, right? And that it's important to be able to discern which layer of reality things are happening at to decide what, if any, response you should have to anything. Because a lot of the players in the various layers of the games, and even some of the non-player characters, are only activated by the kind of attention you give to them, right?
Yes.
Go ahead.
On the same page, totally on the same page.
Yeah. So I think that you know, sometimes when we have something annoying like getting in a small car accident where no one was actually hurt, but it was annoying, cost a lot of money and all that kind of stuff, like sometimes those things happen because you were about to go somewhere where something like irredeemable would have happened, right? And so I'm more I can't believe how many things I've walked away from.
Same.
Yeah.
Bizarre. It seems like it's not a coincidence anymore when it happens so often.
Yeah. So anyway, so that's interesting. I don't remember how we got to the we were just talking about the sort of muggings. So let's move forward a little bit into, like, my guess is going to be, I think the last time I was in New York City was probably 2008, 2009, maybe. And my guess, and tell me if I'm wrong, is it like was pretty much the same for most of the years after that. It pressed along at the same pace most of the rest of the world did in terms of whatever it may have been descending or ascending into. And then, you know, 2020 came. And I have to say that with the possible exception of China, and who knows what to believe when reports are coming in from China, New York seems like it was probably, I don't know if I want to say the scariest or the most disturbing place to be. So can you kind of take us through what that was like?
Well, I can try to. I was living up in Cape Cod at that point, but I started seeing the
Oh yeah, what was happening? What was happening in the buildup that gave you the clue that you had to get out? What was going on?
Well, I was actually seeing, I mean, I don't know if you want to call it psychic or whatever. I have a different opinion of what being psychic means these days, but I've always had these extra abilities since I was a kid. So I've been a, you know, prolific dreamer with precog and premonition dreams my whole life, especially more when I was a kid. And then I started really being able to see things during waking, having visions and clairaudience and things like that. So when I had returned to the city and was living in the West Village. Let's see, I moved in, oh God, I think it was 2018. I started having very strange experiences that I had never really encountered before, as far as just like having a hyper awareness of things and noticing things that I had never seen before. So
Hmm.
I started having these strange visions of these dark, shadowy creatures everywhere.
Hmm.
A lot of them looked like octopi and
Ah.
or cephalopod, whatever, and
Hmm.
all different sizes and shapes. But I saw these weird things kind of scurrying in and out of the corner of my eye all the time. And
Hmm.
I spent some time at the Hearst Tower with a friend who was staying in New York for a while, and there were a lot of really bizarre experiences there too. And I'd be sitting on the
What?
couch.
Okay, I'm looking at it
Oh,
now.
what's that?
I'm looking at it now. I'm going to show the
Oh,
people.
okay. Well, I wasn't in it. I was actually in the building next. And so, yes, you see, it's a very unusual building, and
Hmm.
there's some high woo that goes on
I bet.
there. I had some very strange experiences there. So I'd be sitting on my friend's couch looking at my cell phone, and in the reflection of the phone, I would see these weird, dark, winged beings flying past the windows outside, like
Uh-huh.
reflecting off the Hearst building.
Uh-huh.
And I would just be like, whoa, what's going on there? And I would see um, my friend also saw some of these things. We both saw what we called the golden rain. You'd look out the window and you'd see
Uh-huh.
this very sort of pixelated, shimmery gold. It looked like rain coming down.
Hmm.
Almost as if, in the movie The Matrix with the green uh, numbers that come down the way they do. It sort of looked like that, but it was gold and it was
Hmm.
sort of I don't know how to describe it, just was very pixelated.
Okay.
And then um there was a time I don't want to tell the story again because I've before, but I had a very strange experience where she and I were sitting at the dining table just talking about mundane stuff with laundry and things like that. And I suddenly went into this weird trance and I heard this strange music that seemed to be coming from outside. It sounded like a ticker tape parade. It was very like old timey depression
Uh-huh.
music, and it sounded like it was blasting from one of those. The Hasidic Jews go around those vans and they use the
Yeah.
speakers.
Yep.
It sounded like it was coming off the top of one of those or something.
Okay.
And I I don't know how to describe it. I sort of almost went out the window with the music. Like my consciousness was like getting pulled out to the music. It's a strange thing to try to articulate. And then suddenly I got pulled out of it because I my friend said something to me and our eyes locked and it brought me back into the moment.
Yep.
Um, and I actually had seen in my head what had just happened to me, where this frequency had come through my left ear and into my brain's central processing system and then out my right ear.
Yeah.
And yeah. So there's that. And then I would have all the time, I would see people and hear conversations from other times in that building. I mean, I could go on. But anyway, so I started having these strange experiences, and I would often see these shadowy creatures starting to come, and I just felt like there was something terrible coming, and I would notice the birds acting strange, any kind of nature that was around, because I lived near Washington Square Park, and I spent a lot of time at the park because it was really the closest nature I had.
Yep.
I noticed all the squirrels acting strange. I would have actually pigeons landing on me and birds landing on me regularly, which I
Hmm.
don't know. maybe that happens to other people, but it had never happened to me before. And the skies were getting really ominous. You'd see these big storms rolling in, and I would be like, that's not a regular storm. There's something really sinister coming, and I need to get the hell out of here. And I knew that I had to leave by November, and I didn't know why. So I listened to that, and it all sort of manifested for me because there was no real way of me getting out of there. I didn't have the money or anything, but it all came together to facilitate it for me by the time I wanted to leave.
So, okay, so you just said a bunch of interesting stuff. So interesting that you also tapped into the octopi cephalopod sort of periphery of the eye line type of thing, right? Like,
Yes,
I
and
think,
Nish and I had conversations about it at that time.
yeah, I mean, she and I think we started talking about that in the first or second show we ever did together back in like 2017 or something like that. Or 2018. I can't remember when the first time was, but so that building is fascinating, and I shared a bunch of shots of it for people. And I think in the Patrons Hour, we're going to talk a lot more about cityscapes and buildings. So there was a little kind of preview of some of the things we might touch on there. I just want to say a couple of things about that experience in the building. So I knew exactly what you were talking about when you said the golden rain, right? I've only ever seen it once. And it was in the final of, I think it was a 2008 Wimbledon when Rafael Nadal and Roger Federer were playing, and the match stretched on into the night because there had been all these rain delays, right? And they never, ever play past dark at Wimbledon, but on this night they did, right? They did. They wanted to finish the match. And there came a point in that fifth set. When I say point, I don't mean like a tennis point. I just mean a marker in time, right, where the entire background looked like gold dust particles. It was raining, right? It was raining on and off to that. And I realized that we were experiencing a moment outside of time. Wimbledon is sponsored by Rolex. And that, I think, is what that brand is actually all about, is the sort of creation and encapsulation of time, pockets and bubbles and things like that, right? And they sponsor people who are able to sort of generate or maintain or collapse timelines. But it's almost, I've pulled up pictures over the years of that match. I'll see if I can find a good one right now. Federer Wimbledon final. See, sometimes it was really hard. It's hard to catch, like, on the video. Like when you're watching on TV, you can definitely see it. But it's harder in the pictures. But I remember, like, my mom was here visiting me. Well, not visiting me. I was moving back to Los Angeles from Austin. I've lived here a couple of times, and we were leaving the next day, right? Or that day, maybe even. And I forget what was happening, but the match went on forever and ever. And it seemed surreal, right? And we were both commenting on the gold dust in the air. Let me see if I can find a picture that like accurately captures it. It's hard to in a picture. If I can find one, I'll include it when I post the show. But I knew exactly what you were talking about. It's very pixelated, right? And there's like almost that little sort of like glimmer or sparkle in areas where you're like, what would that be coming from? I'm just looking at the air or whatever, right? Like it's rain. Yeah, I can't find one where it's pretty obvious now, but if I can find one later, I'll include it. But yeah, I think you're in a time event, you know,
I would never really thought about that before, but now that you're saying that, it totally makes sense that that's what that is, because it does feel like everything sort of freezes, suspends. It's a really strange place of focus.
Yeah, everything just slows way down. Every second feels like a moment. Every moment feels like an hour, right? the other thing you said that was interesting was about going into a trance and there was that music.
Yeah.
Right. So this is there. I have a couple of things to say about this, and maybe they're connected, maybe they're not. The jury's still out on that. But I've had that happen a couple of different places, locations that I've been over my life. But the most consistent and unusual with it was the house I was living at in Los Angeles. Right. In the bedroom, we would, we were laying down to go to sleep at night. We didn't hear this during the day, or maybe you're just not quiet enough to notice. But a lot of nights we'd lay down to go to bed, and it would sound like somebody was playing like jazz or blues music or something, but it sounded like 50s music. So Depression era music as well, right? Like it sounded like something from a long time ago. And it sounded like it was coming from, so like there's a driveway behind the bedroom window. Like the house has a very long driveway and then an unattached garage, like in the backyard, right? So it sounded like it was coming from that driveway, but you go outside and you don't hear anything, right? And so one of the
my friends, when I was hearing, I actually asked her, I said, you hear that music out there, right? She's like, what are you talking about? I said, you hear the music? She said, no, and laughed at me. She's like, I don't hear anything.
Right. It's that isn't music I normally listen to. So it's not like we can all have like songs or tunes running through our head that we think we're hearing, but it's really no. When it's something that like is not something that's ever even occurred to you, right? Then like, okay. But we went outside, it wasn't there. I asked the neighbor if she knew anything about it. And she said, oh, maybe it's so-and-so who lives behind you. He has a huge jazz record collection. So one night I went over, it's closer to the fence to his house. It was definitely not coming from there. You couldn't hear it outside anywhere, right? And later we were cleaning out the bedroom, like the middle bedroom in the hallway, and I found boxes of old records that were that music, right? So it's almost like the time got sort of spliced, right? Yeah. And like I was hearing the records being played back in that time, 50s or whatever it is, because my grandma had lived in that. They when they moved from Brooklyn to Los Angeles, in the late 40s or like that, they bought that house right away, right? So it's a family house. It's never belonged to anyone else. So I thought that was interesting. But when I think about all of the times that I have had what I would consider like temporal overlap events that involve music, it's always been to that time period. So I've told the story before, and I apologize to people who, whenever I tell a lot of the stories multiple times because I'm telling them to someone else, and the perspectives are different. I was at a party in an area of downtown Los Angeles that was a little different than the usual area where parties were, like not way off, but just there weren't that many over in this area, right? And I was dancing, and out of the corner of my eye, I kept feeling like I was seeing two things. Sometimes Mexican girls in like dresses that they were twirling, right? But it was like old, not like now, not like if I were to go down to like, the Plaza de la Raza and see something. It seemed like it was from a long time ago. Or I would see like, and I don't know how to call this style, but like, that style of like tap dancing that like black men did like in the 50s.
Yeah.
Like that was to like some of that like jazzy, whatever kind of music. It's called soft shoe. Okay. So I don't know. Thank you, Laura. So whatever it is, but you know what I'm talking about, right? Like I would see them out of the corner of my eye, but when I would turn to look over, they wouldn't be there, right? It was just peripheral. And the reason I recognize that style of dance is because I had once seen a episode of the Cosby Show where he was like having like a tap dance battle with his friend. Yeah. They were dancing like that and then going challenge, right? And the funny thing was this party was called Jello, and Bill Cosby was in the Jello commercials. Yes. So there was like some weird overlap happening, but I was very certain that whatever I was seeing out of the corner of my eyes was like something that happened there, but at a different time. So I went home, and then the next day I like looked up that building and like what it's been over time. And in the 50s, when there was more segregation in Los Angeles, that was where Mexican families had their quinceañeras and Black families had their family reunions.
Get out of here. Crazy.
Right? But it's always that time period. It's always that sort of like 40s, 50s, by the 60s, it's not that. It's 40s and 50s, right? Wartime era, depression. So I'm wondering, like, what that portal, what is connecting the modern time to that? And just earlier today, because we have somebody here who was having also a similar kind of experience. We were talking about hearing sound, like music and sounds, and it's that period of music too, right? Mm. I wonder if somehow we were taken out. I don't want to say taken out like we were like moved to another planet or something. That's not what I mean. But like, I'm wondering if there was like a simulation or like a bubble that was created, like a temporal bubble during that period of time, because something went drastically wrong in the war or with the economy and the depression. And we were put into something as some type of like evacuative or protective measure, right? And time advanced forward inside that space, but it hasn't advanced outside of that space. And so for those of us who are really sensitive, we're picking up on the bleed through.
Yeah, that's a very interesting theory. I like that because I feel like, well, I mean, that could be the reason why so many of us have these weird Mandela effects going on. And some of us remember things one way and others the other way, or some of us remember both.
Right.
There is some kind of alternate bubble, perhaps, that's...
And maybe it's more than one bubble. Right?
I don't know. I don't know if it actually maybe
Russian dolls.
It's maybe like a membrane that passes through other things at times where they intersect and you're able to see.
Or even Russian dolls, like right? Like, and some people are able to move between the different layers and others really can only stay in the layer that they were generated in.
Yes.
Right? So that's, I think something like that may be happening because I haven't heard anybody tell me that about other music. Like I have people, like sometimes I'll be somewhere and like, I always feel like I'm hearing rap music there or whatever, but generally there's like, it's because I heard rap music once there before. So I'm tapping into like a prior experience I had there, but I never listened to this kind of music, right? It's not something that is like wired in my brain from any other experience than that, right? So, okay, so I think something like that may be happening. And I do think only some people are able to sort of feel into that. And it may be because somehow, like we said, some of us can cross more of the membranes than others, or whichever layer of the Russian doll nest we were generated in, right? So maybe we were generated in the one where that we heard that music, and then we've been moved into this other one. And because there's a memory type of connection on some level, even though it doesn't seem front consciousness to us, we're able to hear it, right? Maybe some people never existed in reality where that music was, and so they wouldn't have a way of identifying it, and therefore they don't hear it. It's kind of like when the Indians didn't see the Mayflower coming. I don't know if this is real or not, but let's just go with this because this is a wives' tale, right? They'd never seen boats before, so they didn't see the Mayflower approaching. So they didn't have they didn't have a grid for that or context for that, right? They thought it was big fish or something, right?
It reminds me of the Westworld thing too. I don't know if you saw the last season. I can't remember if you did or not. But,
yes.
Where what's his name, Teddy, is talking to Christina, and they're on the waterfront, and he asks her what she sees, and she says she sees nothing.
Yeah.
It's that kind of thing where it's there, but you can't see it till you see it, or you're never going to see it. Who knows?
Yeah. So, okay. Then the last thing I wanted to say about this, and we'll just use this to kind of tear open what we're going to talk about in the next little bit. And you said something interesting because you did bring up the waterfront, and water has a lot to do with this, I think. Right. But I've never been to Hearst Tower in New York. I didn't even know that there was such a thing as Hearst Tower. And there's a lot of interesting things about Hearst Tower, which we can talk about in the next hour. But immediately I thought Hearst Castle, right?
Yeah.
And I don't know if you're familiar with the idea of Rosicrucian bookends. Are you?
I've heard about it. I don't really recall what it is.
So it's the idea that like there's one on the East Coast and one there. You have to have two on the opposite ends of things, right?
Yes.
So like Disney World and Disneyland would be one. Right. Highway 1 on the East Coast and highway, even though number wise it doesn't make any sense, why would one be in both places? It's like supposed to be going up or down in numbers across, right? But there's Highway 1 is the Pacific Coast Highway and on the East Coast as well, right? This is like the two pillars or whatever, right?
20, things like that, yeah.
So I looked up Hearst Castle, which doesn't look anything like Hearst Tower per se, but look what's in the water. The water, in the water here,
wow.
It looks like, look at this.
Wow.
Right. So in the water there's a couple of good, and then some of these windows, right, and the reflections down, they look like some of the segments of the building. And especially if you see the way these are put together like that.
Yeah.
It looks like some of the different iterations because there's different angles and they look like different things.
Yeah, it's like an echo of sorts.
It echoes and shadows, which is also, right? And if you look at some of the angles, it seems to open up these like little areas that are different, right? That would be sort of like pop throughs or portholes, right? So this is Hearst Castle. I have no idea if they're in some nice chemtrails there as well. There are also pillars here, right? And I don't know if the same people own the building or not. I've gotten to the place where that doesn't even matter, right? If it's named the same thing, it is the same thing, to a certain, on some level, there's some connection that can be drawn. But I just thought that was kind of interesting, and maybe we can explore a little of this because I'm noticing a lot of interesting things with both that building and with Hearst Castle. It also looks a lot like a building that we've been paying attention to in London. But I mean, London Sky, I can't remember the name of the building right now. We did a whole Project Kids chat group about it a few weeks ago, but it's a different shape. It's this building right here. This building looks like the Beacon in Fringe, but it's got that same patterning, even though it's round.
Yeah.
Right. And it looks kind of up here. There's some of that.
It reminds me of the Beacon for sure.
Yeah. The Beacon and Fringe. And then also some of the patterning on the Hearst Tower in New York. Oh, this picture of Hearst Tower in New York from whatever angle that is, looks exactly like it.
Yeah.
That's what it looks like from one angle. So that's kind of fascinating. It looks round or square based on the angle you look at it from. Woo. Okay. All right. We're going to move over into the patron segment where we're going to talk about the sort of variable cityscape skylines and reflective realities of the cities. But before we move over there, do you have any social media or content location or anything like that you would like to share with people who want to check anything else you've had to say out?
Well,
I know you're a jeweler too. So if you want to plug that, go for that too. I did look at that. That's the one thing I knew about you. I did look at your website. I liked.
Yeah, I'm on Instagram and Twitter. My Instagram is more about my art and things like that, and Twitter is kind of a mix. I don't even remember my handle. We'll have to.
You can email it to me and I'll link it.
Yeah, and then I have a website which is just the jewelry. I have been on Noxmente and the Obelisk, and Nish and I did a series called the Kitchen, the Cauldron. Oh my gosh, Kitchen Cauldron with BB Tinsley. We did a bunch of those together where we actually talked about the cephalopods and things, and I don't know what else right now, but
what was your website again for the jewelry?
It's rendeblancbrand.com.
That's right. Okay. I'll include all your links down below. We're going to move over into the supporters segment. So you can go to patreon.com/offplanetmedia, emilymoyer.locals.com, or rockfin.com/Emily Moyer. JJ, this has been awesome. I look forward to continuing on the other side. We'll see you over there, guys.
Thank you. See you.